Now we understand that there was something cosmic that happened. It's left its imprint in the landscape.
That there's stuff that is only produced by massive impacts. These things come in at 70,000 miles an hour.
We modern humans have been on this planet for 150 to 200,000 years, at least.
I believe the evidence supports the view that we have lost a whole civilization from our historical record. We are a species with amnesia.
We modern humans have been on this planet for 150 to 200,000 years, at least. You know, if we go back, say, I think the oldest modern human skeleton ever found was named Homo adultu, and he dates to about 180,000 years, roughly. If we think of a generation of humans as 25 years, that's 7,000 generations of humans. Wow. Right? The question is what were we doing for all those thousands of generations until somebody finally realized, hey, you know what? We can plant crops. We can, we can build cities. We can form communities. We can invent language, et cetera, et cetera. Well, my contention is, and I think the evidence that's accumulating supports this interpretation, that what we're really seeing 7, 8, 9,000 years ago is not the origins of civilization, but the rebooting of civilization. Göbekli Tepe, Gunung Padang, these are apparently structures that were built at least 11 or 12,000 years ago, and I'm waiting to find out the most recent ideas on them. I think that probably they go back much older than that, because from what Graham told me, they're just only in the preliminary stages of being excavated. This is this enormous ruin that appears to be, late Pleistocene ice age in age, that apparently was deliberetely buried, which is interesting. Brings up a very interesting issue. Why would they deliberately bury it? I've been giving it some thought, and what occurred to me was this, and I ran this by Graham, but I haven't gotten a response from him on this. But I started thinking, if it was deliberately buried, why would they bury it? Then I began thinking what we talked about last time when we were talking about the Tunguska event in Siberia, when you had this massive aerial detonation, that was about a 15 megaton explosion. Okay, now that's equivalent to our biggest hydrogen bombs that used to be in the American arsenal.
And it's just because of an asteroid that blew up in our atmosphere.
Yeah, about a 150-foot diameter asteroid, which is not that big, really, relative in the cosmic scale of things. The point, though, is that it was moving really, really fast. Now, think about this. Particularly during the height of the Cold War, in order to protect our missile silos, our super-hardened command and control centers, what did we do with them?
Put them underground.
Put them underground. We buried them, exactly. And I began to think perhaps could explain why it was buried in order to preserve it.
It's really important to understand the role of cataclysms in the story of the Earth. Both Randall and I have really, given a great deal of thought to this, and I think, Randall, the point is that catastrophes are the untold story of our past. There's stuff that is only produced by massive impacts. These things come in at 70,000 miles an hour. And, if they have any diameter at all, if they're 100 meters or more in diameter, they are going to hit the Earth really hard. They're not going to burn up in the atmosphere. And when they do, they pack a huge amount of kinetic energy, a huge amount of heat and shock, and that creates very definite chemical products, so nanodiamonds, so carbon spherules, so melt glass, that's like the trinitite that was produced in nuclear explosions. All of these, when they're all found together in the same layer of soil, and when you can put a date on that layer of soil, and when it's all over the world, there's only one thing can explain them: a massive cosmic impact. And what's fascinating about Göbekli Tepe is the way it doesn't fit, the way there's no background to it, that you would expect to see them practicing, learning architectural skills. The oldest stuff should be the worst, and as they carry on, it gets better. That site ran for 1,000 years. The best stuff is the oldest. 1,000 years later, what they were producing wasn't so good. This is a real anomaly, and it needs to be investigated, not mocked by skeptics, but actually explored to consider maybe this does rock the whole paradigm.
And it's kind of ironic that in their desire to get away from the ancient myths and tales in the Bible, they've ignored those ancient myths and tales which all talk about cataclysms.
The skeptics hate it. They can't bear it because, first of all, it involves cataclysms. And secondly, it involves the possibility of losing a whole civilization from the record. It's really interesting when you look at the dates of this cluster, this episode of bombardment between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. That's the period that just immediately precedes what mainstream academia think of as the very beginnings of civilization. And they've just never, maybe it's not even their fault. This is so recent, this science is so new that they've not had time to adapt to it. But if they adapt to it and take this into account, then suddenly what was an extraordinary and absurd and impossible idea, that there was a lost civilization 12,000 years ago, becomes a very plausible and reasonable idea. And then we start, once we take that on board, then we can start opening our eyes to archaeological anomalies, like the Great Sphinx, like Baalbek, like submerged ruins, like Göbekli Tepe, and begin to consider, what does all this mean? Are we in fact a species with amnesia?
And there's some pyramid-like structures or hills in China as well, right?
There's thousands of pyramids in China. Xi'an, the province of Xi'an, is just the moment you land there from your aircraft, you're seeing pyramids everywhere. I've been
Really?
there. There are certainly hundreds and hundreds of them, distributed across fields, vanishing off into the distance in all directions. They've been terraced and used as agriculture. The local farmers grow crops on them. I went there with Chinese archaeologists. They haven't excavated a single one, not one. And the famous tomb of the first emperor is part of this pattern. It is also a pyramid. It has also not been excavated. The terracotta army around it has been found. And then there's a mythology that's come down, that within the pyramid is a lake of mercury, that there are mechanical devices in there which will fire arrows at you if you go in. That there's a whole story about how intensely protected it is, and up to this day it's not been excavated. And I think one of the mistakes that's made in our civilization is that we are very conceited, we're very big-headed, and we tend to view the whole story of history as though it's a project that leads to us, that we're what it's all about. And I think what is undermining of the existing system about a new take on the past is the notion that we're not what it's all about at all. That there may have been an earlier civilization that reached a high level of advancement, perhaps different from ours, but nevertheless an advanced civilization, which was just taken out of the story completely by a global cataclysm. Then we suddenly realize that in a way we're here accidentally, that it's not been a process that's been all about us, and that if we've been misinformed about how we got here, then we need to get the true information about what's going on. So these are in a way profoundly revolutionary ideas. They do lead people on a path of inquiry that leads to questioning of everything.